Hello there, lovely people, it's Alex from Nintendo Life here, and today we're going to be exploring the evolution and history of everybody's favourite giant ape. Yes, if you've seen the title of the video, you know that today we're going to be talking about Donkey Kong. This sucker's been around just as long as Mario himself. In fact, he had a game before Mario even had a game named after him, so yeah, he's to be respected. This sucker right here, he's important. So why don't we learn a little bit more about this sucker ape? What do you say, DK? He can't talk, he's inanimate. Donkey Kong's first appearance was in the aptly named Donkey Kong, released in arcades in 1981. It was created largely out of necessity to be placed inside the commercially unsuccessful radar scope machines in North America, with the aim being to bring new games to arcades without having to produce more costly cabinets. The fresh-faced Shigeru Miyamoto was placed in charge and originally wanted the game to be a Popeye license. It would have had Bluto in DK's place. Obviously, the license didn't go through and Donkey Kong was born. It's not entirely clear how the titular ape's name came to be, but one story claims that Miyamoto looked for a synonym for stubborn in a Japanese to English dictionary and somehow came up with the word donkey. In Japan at the time, Kong was common slang for gorilla, perhaps in part due to the 1933 film King Kong, so that bit's at least fairly clear. The similarities to the original Kong even led to Universal Studios trying to sue Nintendo for infringing on the King Kong IP. John Kirby of Nintendo came to the rescue by citing a previous case where Universal had actually declared that King Kong and its story were public domain, and as such the film studio had no claim to the name or themes they were trying to protect. The game was ported to myriad platforms, including the Nintendo Entertainment System, as well as nearly a dozen other consoles and home computers over the years. Due to the limited memory available on these home systems, however, most versions only had 3 levels rather than the original arcade's 4. There were also plenty of copycats and other unlicensed versions of the game released. It was pretty popular after all. Sequels in Donkey Kong Jr. and Donkey Kong 3 continued that popularity, and the series of course introduced the world to one of Nintendo's most beloved characters, Stanley the Bugman. Various Game & Watch games were also produced with the Donkey Kong branding, including a direct sequel called Donkey Kong 2 that wasn't anything more than Donkey Kong Jr. Remember, consistency is for losers. (1994) was a particularly strong year for DK. Not only did the original arcade-style game get reimagined in the form of Donkey Kong on the Game Boy, often referred to as Donkey Kong 94, but reimagined all over again in the form of Donkey Kong Country for the Super Nintendo, courtesy of UK-based developer Rare. Rare took the idea of Donkey Kong kicking and screaming into a modern, more Western-focused direction. The pre-rendered 3D graphics and action platforming were a huge departure from what Nintendo had in mind with Donkey Kong 94, redesigning our cherished Kong into the look we now know and love today. Miyamoto originally wanted Donkey Kong to take on a style closer to that of his original design, but Rare gave him a whole new look. And arguably a better one. Miyamoto did, however, come up with the idea of making him wear a tie, which is one of the Kong's most iconic attributes. DK being in the hero role this time meant the introduction of a primary villain, the scaly monarch King K. Rool, who has recently taken a backseat to other, more modern threats. This new series also sparked confusion in the form of Cranky Kong, Donkey Kong's grandfather. The modern Donkey Kong that features in all games is in fact the grandson of the original Donkey Kong from the arcades, who is now, ravaged by time, become Cranky Kong. What happened to DK Jr. is unclear, although it was suggested several times that Cranky Kong is in fact Donkey Kong's father, not his grandfather. You know, to keep things nice and simple. To further complicate matters, Diddy Kong, who made his debut in Country, was originally planned to be a redesign of Donkey Kong Jr. We're through the looking glass now, aren't we? Over the years, Nintendo has clarified the Kong's relationship to a degree, with Cranky Kong as the original arcade version of Donkey Kong, modern Donkey Kong as his grandson, and Diddy Kong as Donkey Kong's nephew. If you want to know what happened to DK Jr. or who Diddy Kong's father is, well, so does the rest of the world. 2 sequels to Donkey Kong Country introduced Dixie Kong, Diddy's girlfriend, and Kiddy Kong, Dixie's cousin. All 3 games were also stripped back and ported to the Game Boy in the form of the Donkey Kong Land series. Later, the full Super Nintendo games were ported to the Game Boy Advance, as well as a Game Boy Color version of the first game. Before we got a Donkey Kong game on the N64, in 1997 a spin-off title called Diddy Kong Racing landed on the 64-bit beast. Presented as an adventure racing game, you took control of one of 3 vehicles and raced around courses in a similar manner to that of Mario Kart. The game was well received and a remake was released for the DS in 2007. This also completely naffed up the family tree by making Tiny look older than her older sister Dixie. But as with every major gaming franchise of the time, Donkey Kong himself also made the leap to 3D in 1999. Donkey Kong 64 was a 3D collectathon platformer in a similar vein to Banjo-Kazooie. Hardly surprising considering Rare was still at the helm. The game introduced a whole plethora of new characters, including Kiddy's older brother Chunky Kong, Dixie's previously mentioned younger sister Tiny Kong, and most importantly, Lanky Kong, who isn't directly related to anyone, but he's still the best. Many complained that the focus on the arguably insane number of collectible items made the game frustrating and repetitive, but even more still hold the game in high regard. Probably people who didn't obsess over reaching 101% completion. Donkey Kong has never appeared in a full 3D platformer since, and in fact this was the game that marked the ape's downfall. After DK64, Rare was bought out by Microsoft in a move that many have considered to be the worst thing to happen ever. Nintendo took back control over the Donkey Kong name, and the Big Bruiser didn't see a mainline game for over 10 years. Instead, various spin-off titles such as Donkey Kong Jungle Beat, the Donkey Konga trilogy of rhythm games, and a renaissance of Donkey Kong 94 with the Mario vs. Donkey Kong series. Whilst none of these games are inherently bad, none of them stood out as amazing in the same way as Donkey Kong Country. For the time being, the ape's true splendor was in the past tense. But of course that didn't last either. After all, you can't keep a good monkey down. Or ape. In 2010, Donkey Kong Country returned with the appropriately named Donkey Kong Country Returns on the Wii. Created by the mother of Metroid Prime Retro Studios, DK was back to his roots and bigger than ever. This rebirth came about because Shigeru Miyamoto wanted to bring DK back in full force, and Kensuke Tanabe suggested that CEO of Retro Studios Michael Kelbau, who had previously worked on the series whilst at Nintendo of America, would be a suitable fit to head up the project. The late then Nintendo president Satoru Iwata believed that the situation that had come about was fate, and being the cheeky chappy that he is, Kelbau gave Returns the codename F8 during development. The game was praised heavily for its difficulty, as similar games at the time such as New Super Mario Bros. Wii had their difficulty stripped back in favor of accessibility to less experienced players. It also introduced motion controls for the first time in the series, which wasn't quite as praiseworthy in many critics' views. David Wise, who composed the soundtrack for the original games alongside Evelyn Fisher and Robin Beanland, also returned for the game, giving it that classic Donkey Kong Country feel. It was so successful that a remake for the 3DS was released shortly afterwards in 2013. Things felt like they couldn't get any better for good old Donkey Kong, and then... Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze burst forth from Retro's ample proverbial bosom. Releasing in 2014 on the Wii U, it was the first proper Donkey Kong game to be made in HD, and more importantly, it did away with all that bloody Wii Remote waggling. Mark Walton on GameSpot gave it a frankly ludicrous 6 out of 10, but apart from that, the critical reception was extremely positive. Later in 2018, the game was re-released on the Nintendo Switch due to only 4.5 people buying the Wii U version. 2 of them were me. This version introduced the first instance of Funky Kong becoming a playable character in a Donkey Kong Country game. His new abilities reduced the at times crippling challenge of the game, allowing less skilled players to enjoy what is, in my opinion at least, the finest Donkey Kong game to date. So what does the future hold for DK? Well, frankly, if we knew that, we'd have made a standalone video boasting about our powers of clairvoyance. For now at least, the future of the first member of the DK crew is anyone's guess. Here's hoping that it's bright, challenging, and most importantly, that when it hits us, it's gonna hurt. In a good way. And there you have it. That is the history of our beloved Kong right here. Personally, for me, he's one of my favourite characters that Nintendo has ever produced. He never used to be, for some reason, just over the past sort of 10 years or so. I've gained a real fondness for this sucker. And the rest of the DK crew, of course. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, then why don't you bongo that subscribe button? And be sure to check out NintendoLife.com for all sorts of lovely Nintendo-related content. Thank you again for watching, bye bye.